Oh, hi there. It looks like you're getting ready to go fishing. Well, good luck out there. Uh-oh, those fishing rods and reels are just all tangled up on each other. They're all just too close and too jumbled up. They're just impossible to get out. What a mess. And oh no, look at how dusty those expensive reels are getting. This off-the-shelf rod storage system just isn't working for you. You need a solution. Well, I have the perfect thing for you. Introducing the ultimate fishing rod storage cabinet from Made by Lions. This custom-built cabinet has all of the features you need to securely and effectively store your fishing rods. More than just looking good, these doors protect your reels from any dust and debris. The foam inserts securely keep your rods in place right where you put them. No more cramming your reels into a small confined space, or having to spread your rods out over a huge area just to be able to get them off the wall. The alternating heights make that job super easy. Let's see how well this works in action. Choose any rods you want, it doesn't matter. Wow, look at that! You got 2 rods off at one time with no hassle at all. And putting them back is also a breeze. Simply set them in and slide the rod into the secure foam padding. Amazing! Let's see how it's made. For this build, I decided to go with a 4x8 sheet of walnut plywood. I decided to go with walnut even though it's a little more expensive, just because I figured if I'm going to go to all the trouble of filming this, I might as well make it look a little bit nicer. But any sheet of plywood would do. I have the measurements of this cabinet such that you can build the entire thing out of one 4x8 sheet of plywood. And I do intend to have some build plans at some point later, so please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss it when I come out with that video. So in getting started here, I'm just sort of breaking this piece down into more manageable sizes. And then I will get my final dimensions cut on the table saw. I was very careful in my measurements to ensure that this cabinet would be deep enough to hold the fishing rods. My fishing setups are pretty standard, but if you happen to have some larger rigs, maybe for some heavier duty saltwater fishing, you could obviously make it just a little bit deeper to suit your needs. I'm cutting these side pieces and the top piece at a 45-degree miter just so that they have a cleaner finish. Next, I'm going to work on the top piece, which will hold the foam inserts for where the rods are going to slide into place. I just need to mark out all of the center points of each hole that I'm going to drill. And each hole is going to be drilled with a 1-inch Forstner bit. I was very careful here in my markings so that I could have all of the holes equidistant from each other, but I also wanted to make sure that there was enough space between each of the rod and reel setups. Also being careful to make sure that these holes were not too far apart so that the cabinet would not become too wide while still being able to hold 12 rods. So after a bunch of drilling and a whole lot of wood shavings flying everywhere and making a giant mess, this top piece is ready for the next step, which is going to be to cut out the space for the rod to actually slide all the way to the back of those holes. I knew I wanted to make some straight lines for each of these holes to help guide me when I'm cutting out these spaces, but I kind of went back and forth on how I would actually go about cutting out these spaces. I figured I could use either the bandsaw, or maybe make a template and then use a router with the template, or just the jigsaw, but the router and the bandsaw had some drawbacks. For one, my bandsaw is still in a box, so I didn't feel like doing a whole nother project before completing this one. And second, with the router, I'm only making one of these, but if I was making multiples, I probably would make a template out of MDF, and that would actually be 100% perfect with the cuts and everything would be perfectly straight, and then just use a router to trace that onto my actual stock piece. But again, because this one is just for me and I actually don't know while I'm building this how well it's going to work out, I didn't want to put too much effort into something that may or may not even be necessary. Some of you eagle-eyed viewers probably noticed that some of my lines to the holes are not perfectly straight, but that's okay. You really can't tell in the final product, and it certainly doesn't affect the performance. And speaking of eagle-eyed viewers noticing mistakes, you'll see here as I'm marking out this piece that somewhere along the lines I messed up the math on these pieces and I cut it about 3/4 inch too narrow. So I had to glue on a 3/4 inch piece of plywood. So that's what that weird little line is there. So this is much the same process as before, only this time I didn't really need to mark out all 12 spots. I only needed to do every other one because this is the bottom piece that will support the rods that are sitting on the bottom of the cabinet. I hope you enjoy how artistic I am with all of these different angles. I'm not saying I'm going to win any awards for editing or anything like that, but that's really just because I don't know if YouTube has editing awards. I don't know, maybe they do. And here comes some more marking out center points for circles. It's pretty exciting, I know, and these are the pieces that will actually be raised above the bottom of the cabinet so that my rods can be on alternating heights. I'm just making these out of one of the extra pieces of plywood that I had, and then I'll cut them down to size on the miter saw. And after some more editing magic and forgetting to turn on the camera for the miter saw, I have 6 perfect little rectangles for my rods. To attach these, nothing too fancy, just some pocket holes, and in fact the whole cabinet is assembled with pocket holes, and they were really plenty sufficient for this project. For the foam inserts, I'm going with this air conditioner weather seal. I will put a link to something similar to the one I picked up in the description below. And then I'm just going to cut it into about 1.5 2-inch long pieces. Wasn't really anything specific as for how long I was doing these, just kind of whatever I thought looked right. And after getting them all cut, and then I need to make the slits in them. And also I wanted to make sure that I kind of cut out a little open void so that the rods had a place to sit in there nicely. This feature is really important to keeping the rods stable when they're in the cabinet, while also holding them in place so they can't just fall out through the open space. Hot glue is perfect for getting these in place because it dries so quickly and it won't just seep into all of the holes of the foam. And on this first one, I definitely learned that I made a mistake of trying to put all the glue in at once, whereas you'll see that this foam was kind of hard to get into place because the glue was all drying up so fast I couldn't really manipulate it the way I wanted it to. And so I fiddled around with it for quite a while and just end up having to add more glue anyways. But nonetheless it's in there, and I give it a quick test, and I like the resistance that the foam provides on that screwdriver. But I learned my lesson, and I'm only going to apply glue at the end first, and then I will go back in on the sides and add glue. And this made for a much cleaner and nicer look on the foam inserts. And not that it's really that important, but yeah, that one on the right just looks pretty ugly compared to the other one. Again, this is something that if I were making these for somebody else to actually purchase them from me, I would want to make sure that it has a cleaner finish. So I'm glad that on this first model here, I kind of have learned a lot of different things about what works and what doesn't, and what I would do better on the next time. So I'm going to make a line across the width of the board, which will represent the height of where those extra rod support pieces will go. And then I just need to make some marks that will represent one of the corners for those pieces so that I know where to screw them on later. So now I have all of my pieces cut and ready to assemble, which, as I mentioned before, will be done with pocket screws. And the location of all the pocket holes and pocket screws will be such that you don't see any of them. Just being careful to make sure all of my pieces are flush with each other. It's time to get some clamps attached and get these pocket screws fastened in there. Clamps come off and everything is perfect. I'm using these 2x4s to support the piece because I'm going to be working on the back side, because that's where all the pocket screws are at, so that they are not seen. I will put a link for these 90-degree pieces. They are great for this type of application. It gives me something to put my piece up against, but it also gives me something to clamp when it's an awkward clamping situation. So I get it attached, check it one more time, and I'm ready to drive in these fasteners. You definitely kind of have to hold some pressure on that other side though, but as long as your clamping is good, the fastener will bring the pieces together and they shouldn't travel and mess up your alignment. And using the marks I made earlier, I can go ahead and get all 6 of these other rod support pieces attached. For the side pieces, I am going to use some wood glue on those mitered corners, and I don't have any 48-inch clamps, so this part was a little complicated for me. That's why I have to end up using 2 clamps, but it really works out fine. It's not really a big deal. Just get them clamped on both ends, and I'm ready to drive in fasteners just like before. I know I didn't show myself drilling all of these pocket holes, but I promise I didn't outsource this to some other country. I really did do it myself. And you'll also see that I had some pocket holes for the bottom support piece onto those side panels as well, just to provide more attachments and more stability. So I just repeat the same process as before, get these fasteners driven in there, and this cabinet is assembled. The next step for me is to get this hung on the wall. But first, I'm going to go ahead and give this cabinet its first real test. Let's see, I want that middle rod. Let's watch how easily it comes out. Oh yeah, that's nice. I'd say this will work out just fine. After quickly removing the old setup, I'm ready to get this cabinet attached to the wall. Now I could have gone about this a few different ways. I could have just used some legs to raise it off the ground, or I could have just simply had it laying on the ground. I elected to use some lag screws into the studs, but looking back, I think that was actually probably a mistake. I probably should have just used a French cleat, which would have been a lot easier and a lot quicker, as opposed to this whole crazy mess of drilling the holes and then getting the exact locations of the holes and transferring those holes onto the cabinet. That was just way more complicated than it needed to be. I just kind of got blinded by what I was doing, which was I wanted the cabinet to have as low of a profile as possible so that it stuck out from the wall the least amount possible. But in actuality, another 3/4 of an inch for a French cleat probably wouldn't have made a difference. But it certainly would have made the install much easier. So as it is, I'm back to using some 2x4 spacers. I'm just going to set these down and then try to set the cabinet on them and get the holes that I drilled lined up with the holes that I drilled into the wall and the studs. And in actuality, this ended up working fine, but it was just so much more complicated than it needed to be. So if you were to make this, I would recommend either just using a French cleat or maybe even attaching some legs to the bottom of your cabinet if you want it raised off the ground a little bit. I'm sure I'm not the only one that does this, where you have a certain process in mind and you just kind of get tunnel vision and you really don't even consider other options until after it's too late. And that's what happened with me on this, but, well, I learned my lesson and I can pass my experience on to you. All that said, I am very happy with the result. It looks really good, and now I'm ready to work on the doors. For my doors, I'm going to use this edge banding I picked up off Amazon. I will put a link in the description below, but this was a great value and it came in walnut, which is exactly what I needed. I decided to use edge banding for the edges of the doors because I didn't want any plywood edges showing. And these doors are going to be full overlay doors, so you won't see the plywood edge from the side of the cabinet either. My plywood is actually 11/16 and this edge banding is 3/4 of an inch. So I did have to make sure I just lined up one edge so that when I went to trim off the other edge, I only had to trim off one edge. The glue does melt and then dry pretty quickly, so don't expect to really be able to move it much after you get that iron going on it. It's really not necessary, but I just want to go ahead and make this look as nice as possible, given that I elected for the more expensive plywood option with the walnut finish. I probably should have trimmed from the top instead of from the underneath. I don't know why I didn't, but either way, the doors came out really nice, and I like the way this finished. I'm going to use this Craig jig for drilling the holes for the hinges. This thing works great, so I'll put a link in the description below for this on Amazon. I'm going to use 3 hinges on each door just because the doors are pretty heavy and I want it to be plenty strong. So with this hinge jig, all I'm going to be doing is marking off 3 separate spots on the board so that later when I go to drill the holes, they're all in the same spot on each door. There's not really any specific place they needed to be, just kind of wherever I thought would look the best. So you simply just attach some clamps, and it comes with the exact size Forstner bit that you need to drill the holes. The jig can be adjusted for hinges that are a different length from the edge of the board, and you also just want to make sure you set your depth stop to the appropriate mark based on what hinges you have. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward and it goes really quickly, and it really makes the job of getting these hinges on there pretty much foolproof. So again, I just place the hinge jig based on where I had my marks from before, clamp them down, and I do this for the rest of the holes that I need. And once I get that done, I'm ready for the hinges. A nice little trick for screwing these hinges in without having them move or rotate is to use a straight edge, in my case a level, and just sort of push the hinges up against it. They sort of self-straighten themselves, and this makes it a lot easier to screw them in and to prevent them from rotating or anything that would cause the doors to not function properly. Repeat the process and I have 2 doors ready to go. I do want to point out that I made sure that the grain of the doors was the same on the front because the front and back of the plywood does not look the same at all. So I'm just going to do my best to sort of shimmy these into place, and because I had holes on the top for where the rods are going to go, I was actually able to see really nicely what I was doing, and I was able to screw these in while looking through the top. And then before I go ahead and screw any of the others in, I'm going to adjust it just to make sure, because I do have 3, it can get a little wonky if you start screwing them all in before adjusting them. I keep the door shut while screwing the rest of the hinges into place just to make sure that the door doesn't slide out away from the cabinet at all. One last adjustment on the hinge so that it slides into place where it needs to be, and I am ready for finishing on this project. For my finish, I'm going with this Watco Danish oil that I had laying around. You don't really need to apply finish, and especially in my case, if I wasn't filming this, I probably wouldn't bother because I would have used a cheaper plywood and it's just going to be in my garage. But if you're going to have your cabinet in a place like a finished basement or somewhere else where it might be seen, certainly go ahead and apply a nice stain or finish, depending on what kind of plywood you used. This walnut plywood doesn't need anything except for an oil finish. I really like this Danish oil for this purpose. It's really easy to apply, just wipe it on or brush it on, and then after about 15 minutes of letting it soak in, you just wipe it off with a dry cloth. You'll notice as I'm going here that you can see the edges of the doors where I put the edge banding, and I'm really glad I did this because it prevents you from seeing those plywood edges, and it just makes the project look more complete. It would be pretty silly if I used this expensive walnut plywood and then left those exposed plywood edges. It just wouldn't look quite right. So after attaching some handles, this project is done. It came out looking really nice, and more importantly, I couldn't be happier with how it functions. The alternating rod positions really solve the problem of getting the rods off the rack and putting them back on without any issues. And my rods live in a wood shop, so they're going to get dustier than most people's, but no matter where you put your rods, whether it be the garage or the basement or anywhere else, they're bound to get dust and debris on them, which is not good for those reels. So these doors are going to do a great job of keeping the reels clean, and it also looks really nice. And another added benefit is down the line I can add some storage to the insides of the doors for other fishing gear. Let me know in the comments what you think, and also if you'd be interested in some build plans for this project. I hope you like this video. This is one of the first videos I've made, and I've learned a lot, but I'm sure I have a lot more to learn. If you haven't already done so, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and happy building!